Hi everyone. Today we're talking about Plato's dialogue, the Crito, which is named after one of the characters in this dialogue, the other being Socrates, both of whom have a conversation while Socrates is awaiting his death in prison. So important points that we're going to cover here. First, we're going to take a look at Socrates' reasoning as to why majority opinion supposedly does not matter. Second, we're going to look at Crito's argument as to why Socrates should escape from prison. And finally, we'll look at Socrates' counter-argument as to why his escaping prison would be the wrong thing to do. So just some background on the dialogue. As we know from the Apology, Socrates was found guilty for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of Athens. Sentenced to death. While he's awaiting his death sentence, he's waiting out in prison. His friend Crito shows up to visit him and urges Socrates to escape. So you get the sense that it was feasible and perhaps very easy for Socrates to escape prison, at least in Plato's version of the story here. Perhaps that's because the Athenian authorities didn't want to make a martyr out of him and actually wanted him to leave so he would stop being a problem for them. But Socrates stubbornly refuses to leave and says, "No, I'm going to stay here." However, he knows that it would be just dogmatic if he didn't listen to the reasons that Crito might be able to offer him as to why he should escape from prison. So Socrates says, "Look, I think I should stay here. That's my starting position. But if you have an argument as to why I'm wrong, I'm open to it. So please let me hear it, and I will try to evaluate that fairly. And if you can convince me with good rational grounds, then okay, fine, I'll escape prison and avoid death as you would like me to do." So the first thing is that Crito mentions that a lot of people will think ill of Socrates if he stays in prison. They'll view that as a kind of admission of guilt. They'll think, well, this guy was killed by the state. Maybe he deserved it, right? He wasn't honorable enough to defend himself successfully and or to escape from prison. So perhaps the sentence is not unjust after all. Maybe Socrates deserves what he gets. That might not be the strongest argument, but Crito says that many people will think that way and form a poor opinion of Socrates. And Socrates asks, well, why should I care about that? Why does it matter what the majority thinks? They would be wrong. Socrates thinks if they think that I'm doing something cowardly or something unjust, they're just mistaken, and that doesn't affect me as long as I believe the truth and try to act in a morally right way. That's the only thing that matters. So why should I care about what the majority happens to think? And Crito counters with, well, the majority can inflict great evils upon us. So for example, if the majority of a group thinks that you're guilty of some serious crime, they can ostracize you. If they have the right authority, they can throw you in prison, they can kill you. And Crito reasons kind of plausibly that these sound like pretty bad things, right? Things that we would like to avoid. So perhaps for that reason, Crito says we should take into account what the majority thinks, right? The opinions of others do matter because what other people think will affect us. And Socrates says, well, actually, that's not true, that other people can't, through their mere opinions, inflict great evils upon us, certainly not the greatest. Socrates argues that the greatest ill that can befall someone is to be a fool, to be an unwise person, and into that we could also lump being an unjust person. And Socrates says no matter how many people have the opinion that you're a bad person, that you acted wrongly, that you're cowardly, or whatever it may be, if they're wrong, then they're simply wrong. It doesn't matter, right? Socrates says, I'm not a fool. I've tried my best to do the right thing. And if other people don't see that, that seems like it's their problem, not mine, right? They can't turn me into a fool, even if they think that I am one. So an implication of this sort of interesting argument that you see in a number of ancient Greek philosophers is that what matters most to us is something that is always within our own power. Socrates seems to reason that even if people can harm me physically, even if people have a bad opinion of me, I have a poor reputation in the community, none of that matters, at least not nearly as much, as the fact that I can still pursue what's true, what's good, what's beautiful. Right? Things like justice and goodness are still within my control. Nobody can force me to be a bad person, even if they overwhelmingly think falsely that I'm a bad person. So this is kind of a prelude to the more central arguments that we're about to get into in a moment, but it's an interesting entryway, I think, to Socrates' mindset, that he at least seems to claim that what matters most is always within our own power, and that the greatest evils cannot be brought upon us without our consent. So Socrates continues along that line and says, if we're going to care about anyone's opinions, it should be the opinions of wise people, those who know what they're talking about, right? Those who, for example, have the facts, but not just that, who also have good judgment, who are wise in the way that they see things, who understand what really matters, and who can judge accordingly, right? So if you met somebody that you're convinced, yes, this is a good, wise person, then their opinion actually holds some weight, not simply because it's an opinion, but because it's the opinion of the sort of right kind of person, a mind that has actually thought carefully, that has knowledge, and that can make good judgments. Right, so Socrates says the wise people know what is true and good, whereas the opinions of the unwise, which he seems to lump the majority into that, are useless because such people don't know what they're talking about. They lack knowledge. And Socrates often gives analogies to this sort of example in his dialogues. If you're trying to figure out what should I do for my health regimen, you don't go and take an opinion poll of the public, right, and say, well, what does the majority think? Because although they could be right about what's good for your health, there's no good reason to think that the majority knows what it's talking about in that case. They probably don't have a good justification. Whereas somebody who's actually trained in the relevant medical field, right, like a doctor, for example, is much more likely to have a justified opinion. And their advice and their diagnosis is more likely to be accurate. So you are better off trusting their views if you have to trust anyone's opinion. Now, of course, doctors and experts can still be wrong about all sorts of things, so this isn't a guarantee that what they say will always be true, but remember, this is a matter of justification. So Socrates is asking what justifies someone's opinion. Well, in many cases, it's nothing, right? People just have opinions and they don't know what they're talking about. Whereas in other cases, for example, a trained expert in some area will be at least justified, right? They can still make mistakes, but they'll at least have good reason behind the opinions that they present. So let's move into kind of the central arguments about the nature of law and why, if ever, we should obey the law. And Crito starts off with an argument where he sort of says, okay, if we don't care about the opinions of others, especially the majority, let's move on to something more direct. He tries to appeal to Socrates' reason. Socrates says he's open to it, and this is roughly Crito's argument. So he says Socrates has been unjustly sentenced to death, right? He wasn't actually guilty of corrupting the youth or of not believing in the gods. And even if he were, you might say that the sentence of death is unnecessarily harsh. So basically, and most people seem to agree with this, that the trial of Socrates was kind of a sham, right? It was just some people with power in the community just didn't like this guy, wanted to get rid of him. Socrates was kind of a smart ass at his trial, so a majority of the jurors ended up finding him guilty and sentencing him to death. But there's no justice here, Crito says. Secondly, and this you can think of this as the second premise of the argument, Crito reasons that there's no obligation to obey an unjust sentence. And he concludes from these two claims that Socrates is therefore permitted to escape from prison. So Crito thinks, to put it briefly, that escaping from prison, yes, technically it would violate the law, but in this case, you are violating an unjust application of the law, that it's permissible in this case to go against the law and to leave prison, because the original reason why Socrates is there in prison is really just a mockery of the law, right? The law has been abused to put him in these bad circumstances, and therefore Crito thinks Socrates has no obligation to obey the law. Of course, there's all sorts of questions we can ask about this argument, holes we could poke into it, but at least on the surface, it seems like Crito has a decent point, right? Whether you ultimately agree or not, you can kind of get the reasoning that, well, yeah, if the law is being abused to hurt me, then why should I respect that at least particular application of the law? Why should I stay in prison and put up with the sentence when the whole thing has just been a sham from the start? Okay, so Socrates, he claims, right, and most people would agree that he is actually open to being persuaded by a good argument, but he thinks Crito's argument has not worked. He doesn't think that it is sufficiently convincing, and Socrates instead gives a counter-argument for why he should remain in prison, even though apparently it would be easy for him just to walk out the door and never return to Athens. So this is Socrates' argument in brief. So one claim he makes is that the laws of Athens have been a great benefit to Socrates throughout his life. So Socrates is, I think it's about 70 years old at this point, right? He's lived in Athens his entire life. He says the laws here are by and large good, and I, Socrates, have learned a lot from them. They have benefited me in many ways. They have educated me in the ways of justice. They have provided me a society in which I can work and think and interact with other people. And although it's true, right, he agrees with Crito that some corrupt people are misusing the laws, it's not the laws themselves that are at fault, it's the individual people who are being unjust. So, okay, claim one, premise one, the laws of Athens have been beneficial to Socrates. That by itself doesn't prove anything, but it's going to be an important point in his argument, a part of it. So Socrates next claims that if he escapes from prison, he would be violating those same laws, the laws of Athens, those very laws that have benefited him throughout his life. And why would this be the case? Well, the law says that a jury has the legal authority to find somebody guilty of a crime and to pass a sentence. And that's what happened to Socrates. He went through the legal process. He was found guilty. He's now facing the consequences of what the jury found to be the case. So you might say Socrates had his day in court. The jurors made their judgment. And, well, if I go against that, I would be violating the law because the law says we should respect the findings of the jury. Next, Socrates says it would be wrong to violate good laws. And he concludes, well, because all three of these claims are true, I ought to remain in prison. It would be wrong for me to leave prison because I would be violating the law. In this case, the laws are good because they are the laws that have been beneficial to me throughout my whole life, and it is wrong to violate good, just laws of this sort. So, Socrates reasons, it would not be right for me to escape from prison. I have to stay here, and even though, right, some corrupt jerks have abused the law and put me here, nonetheless, all of the legal procedures were followed. And if I go against this law just because I don't like it in this case, or because I think it's been put to a bad use, then that seems to undermine the authority of all the laws. And because I've admitted through my whole life by voluntarily staying here in Athens that the laws are good and beneficial and worthy of our respect, I would be a hypocrite if I now went against that and ditched my sentence and disrespected the law in that sort of way. So it's an interesting sort of argument. You can kind of see where Socrates is coming from. Maybe you could see how Crito could raise some objections, which he tries to do. Right. So the one obvious one is simply to say that, yeah, but the sentence is unjust. Right. This is a case of not just law, of good law. Right. Crito would agree, sure, you should obey good laws, but this is a bad law, or at least a bad use of the law. But you can already sort of see how I'm kind of shifting between saying the law is bad and the application of the law is bad. That's where Socrates thinks he gets Crito's argument, or he sort of pins Crito down and shows him the mistake. Socrates says, yes, the application of the law is unjust, but that's people being unjust. Persons have done this to me. It's not the fault of the laws themselves. Right? The laws are good, that you face a jury of your peers, you abide by their findings, whether you like it or not, agree or not. So that's what I, Socrates, have to do. If he escaped prison, he wouldn't just be disrespecting those individuals who were unjust to Socrates, he would be disrespecting the laws themselves, which Socrates, as we saw in his previous argument, that would be wrong. So it leads to a sort of interesting distinction where we might say perhaps a particular application of the law is unjust, but if the law in general is just, I should still respect and obey that law, even in circumstances like this. And Crito, like many of Socrates' discussion partners, says, well, okay, I guess you win. I can't come up with a good counter-argument to what you've said. I, Crito, have tried my best. But as usual, Socrates, you give a good argument, so I guess you're just going to stay in prison and end up dying. And that's what happens. So if you read the dialogue, the Phaedo, that's a discussion Socrates has about the nature of the soul and whether the soul is immortal with his friends right before he dies. And then at the end of that dialogue, he drinks the poison, and that's the death of Socrates. So we never would have had that dialogue, right, if Socrates had taken Crito's advice and escaped from prison. So some open questions that we might end with, just to think about. Is it really true that Socrates is not being harmed by the laws? As I sort of suggested, he draws this distinction seemingly between an application of the law, which is done by persons, perhaps in an unjust way, and the law itself. So does that distinction ultimately work in this case? Can Socrates really say, the law is doing me no harm, it's just people, and I can't violate the law, so I guess I have to stay here? Secondly, a general question, is it ever justified to violate a law, and under what circumstances? Of course, there are many examples in history of people violating laws in ways that, in retrospect, we think were the right thing to do, right? Where we say that, yeah, that was actually just because the law itself was in the wrong. But you can see if you take that some distance, things start to maybe break down, right? Do we say that any imperfect law can be violated? Can anyone decide when a law is imperfect or not? Right, lots of questions we can ask there and about both theory and practice. Third, does Socrates give a good argument as to why he should remain in prison, or are there some holes in his reasoning? And finally, a very general question, why should we care about the law at all? Socrates gives kind of a more intrinsic argument about the value of law, by which I mean he argues that the laws themselves are good and have been beneficial to him, and it would therefore be thankless and sort of just intrinsically unjust to disobey them, to go against them, which is an interesting sort of argument. Many others have made arguments of a practical sort, where they've said, well, we should care about the law and we should obey laws even when they have bad applications, because if we don't, then we lose all of the practical and social benefits of having law. Right? Again, if anyone could decide to disobey a law and get away with it whenever they wanted to, then there seems to be no point to having a law at all, and people will have their standard worries about anarchy and that sort of thing. Right? So you might say we should simply accept imperfect laws, knowing that sometimes innocent people will be found guilty, and that sometimes the laws will have unintended consequences, or that people will use them in cynical, abusive ways. But perhaps that's worth it for the trade-off of all the benefits we get from having a stable society in which there are legal procedures that we can appeal to. Now, that's not really Socrates' argument. He talks more about the benefit to himself of the laws and how just laws require respect. But you can also see the more practical argument that someone might make in favor of obeying the law. Okay, so that's it for this time. I hope you learned something. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.